Record. So, hi everyone. This is Robert Swarwood. I am here with author Chris Holm, who is the author of this most recent book, Child Zero. But he's also the author of the Collector trilogy, which blends crime and fantasy, and the Michael Hendricks thrillers. The first Michael Hendricks novel, The Killing Kind, was named the New York Times Editor's Choice, a Boston Globe Best Book of 2015, and a Strands Magazine's number one book of 2015. It won this 2016 Anthony Award for Best Novel and was also nominated for Barry, Lefty, McCavity, his second Hendricks novel, Red Hand. Actually, this is an old bio. I just realized this is an old bio, Chris, because that one came out, if I remember correctly, in 2016, correct?
Mm-hmm. Yep.
And so Child Zero, I mean, we're now in 2022, so that's a 6-year gap, which we can certainly talk about.
Yes, it is. Yes, it is.
So thank you, Chris, for joining us, or joining me, because God knows who's really watching right now.
Hey, my pleasure. You know, I always view these as just a fun excuse to get to chat with other writers or booksellers or wherever. This is just a kick, you know?
Absolutely. That is why I started kind of doing it, just to kind of like touch base with writers that I don't really, like talk to really in person often. I mean, because we've known each other, quite honestly, online. We've been online friends, I guess is the best way to say it, for quite a while. I was trying to think the other day, I'm like, how long have I really, known you? And I was probably, well, I think my first interaction with you, or at least how the first time I came to your work, was reading the Best American Mystery Stories. And I've had to look it up. It was the 2011, the one by Holm and Coben. And that was the one that featured your story, The Hitter. And I remember reading that because usually, I mean, mostly with most anthology stories are going to be hit and miss. So oftentimes stories are good, but there are going to be ones that really speak to you. And there are going to be stories that are kind of like, yeah, it's good. But yours, I remember really like liking. And I remember being like one of those, I went to Amazon to look up what else you had. And, I'm sure I maybe had come across some of your short fiction prior to that too. And but that was one where I was like, oh shit, this is really good. And then eventually you put out the you were going to do a whole novel about the Kia guy, and I was like, oh, so I want to talk about that, but I guess before we get to your new book, before we get to all of that, let's start back to the very beginning. On the day you were born, was the okay, I guess that's a little bit too soon, but yeah, when did you first kind of decide, what, this is what I want to do? I really like to read. I really, writing is something that became a passion, because I know that you have I think in one of the bios I had read, a lot of times for a lot of writers, I don't want to say it's a hobby, but it starts out at least as a hobby, because it doesn't really become a career. So at what point maybe did you start as a hobby and then realize this is something I want to make as a career?
That's an interesting question for a couple of reasons, because I think, first off, like a lot of writers, I have written my entire life. I used to draw comic books when I was little. I used to write stories. I was actually sent to the principal's office in second grade for a story I wrote that was, I guess a little bit on the violent side. I didn't know I was being questioned to find out whether or not I was a sociopath. I just thought that he was really impressed with this story I wrote about aliens coming and wiping out humanity. But I grew up in a kind of a working class family, really practical working class people. They were readers. My entire family are avid readers, but it never occurred to me that writing was something I could do as a career. It was always something that I remember a notebook when I was in like middle school that I hid under my bed. I was writing some sort of dystopian thriller that I never showed anybody. And I probably filled one notebook before I ran out of steam. It really wasn't until I got into grad school and realized I just wasn't happy in the sciences that I was like, maybe I need to turn my attention to the things that actually fulfill me, as opposed to what other people think I should be doing with my life. And that was when I got serious about writing. I dropped out of a PhD program, took a job as a lab tech, and just started writing on nights and weekends. I had no idea if I'd be any good at it. My wife had no idea if I'd be any good at it, which was probably terrifying for her, but thankfully it seems to have worked out all right. How about you? I mean, when did you start writing?
So I mean, probably in elementary, I think I probably would like to. It was always very, very creative.
Hmm.
But probably in sixth grade was when the movie Jurassic Park came out,
Oh yeah.
and that was just life changing. Especially, I mean, I'm a sixth grader, and it's like this crazy movie, and then that got me into Michael Crichton. At the time
Hmm.
before, I was reading a lot. I'd read like all the Hardy Boys, and I was reading stuff like that. But at that point was when all of a sudden, I guess I kind of graduated to the more adult books. So,
Hmm.
Drawn and Restrained, and even like Rising Sun. I mean, certain books that maybe a sixth grader probably shouldn't read, because I remember there's a lot of sex in Rising Sun. And
Yeah.
then from there, it went to Stephen King. And I remember my very first Stephen King book was Insomnia.
Oh
And
wow.
I remember, yeah, it's not one of those probably good entry points for a Stephen King book, but it was my very first one. It was a paperback, and I remember reading it. I think I finished it when I was like visiting my grandmother up in like New York, and I remember being out in the yard and finished it. And I just thought to myself, this is what I want to do. Like I
Hmm.
want to, like it was just, it was amazing experience just at the end, being like, oh shit, like that was amazing. um but well, so Michael Crichton though actually made me think about, like, was that an influence for you
Oh, it
at
was a
all?
huge influence growing up. But for me, so first of all, Crichton's a huge influence on Child Zero specifically. I went into this book very cognizant of the fact that I was trying to write one of those really high concept whiz bang thrillers in the vein of Michael Crichton. But apart from that, um, my family were avid but indiscriminate readers, and they tended to read whatever was at the top of the New York Times bestseller list. Always fiction. My family never read nonfiction for whatever reason. Uh, and my first grown-up book actually was a Stephen King novel. It was The Tommyknockers, which I was 9. I was way too young to be reading The Tommyknockers. Um, but I was also this kid who tested well in the sciences, got into an advanced science program. I was a huge science nerd. I loved the science fair in school. And so when I discovered Crichton, and I think I read the Andromeda Strain first actually, but when I discovered him, it it felt like nothing else I'd read. My one side of my family big fantasy and sci-fi geeks, and so I'd read plenty of science fiction. But what Crichton was doing struck me as different because it took place essentially in the real world, essentially in the present, and it incorporated all this like bleeding edge stuff that you would learn about in school or read about in, I don't know, the nerdy magazines that dorky kids read. But like I remember uh, with Jurassic Park, it's everybody was geeked about the dinosaurs, and I was a 13-year-old boy. I was geeked about the dinosaurs too, but I was also really psyched uh, that it was basically like a genetics lesson because I was at the age where I was just starting to understand what sorts of science I was interested in, and I ended up becoming a molecular biologist. I played with DNA and RNA for a living for a lot of years, and certainly um, Jurassic Park was a big part of that. And now I can look back and nitpick and say, here's how he cheated here and there, to pull his story off. But at the time, it was just mind-boggling, and I feel like he gave everybody an education about DNA, about how it works, and yeah, it was just really wild. It was super super influential to me, not just as a writer, but in my science career too.
Yeah, well, what's interesting, I mean, in retrospect, and when you think about Crichton, was, I mean, he at the time was probably like number one best-selling worldwide bestseller,
Hmm.
but essentially he was a pulp novelist.
Oh yeah.
I mean, and you even look at a lot of his early stuff, which I don't know. Have you ever read any of his early stuff, like
Oh, absolutely. In fact,
the John Lang ones, I think are called,
yeah, if I
or
tilt my screen up that way a little bit, you're
yeah,
going to see an awful lot of hard case crime books,
yeah.
and they reissued a bunch of his. Um, yeah, the John Lang. Yeah, I remember one about a salvage boat that was really fun stuff. But yeah, he came up in the pulps. He wrote some really terrific pulp fiction, and I think he carried that sensibility over when he started writing under his own name. I mean, he he his books move like pulp novels. You could also argue that his characterization is on the thin side like a pulp novel too, but that doesn't bother me as a reader now, or as somebody who as a kid was just turning pages to get through the story as fast as possible. He was just telling really cool stories. And you mentioned Rising Sun. I mean, God, he wrote Sphere, Disclosure, Congo. He would write about, genetically modified apes guarding an ancient diamond mine. And then he would write about, sexual harassment in the workplace, or, the clash of cultures between US corporate culture and Japanese corporate culture. And I'm not saying that they were all equally successful, but he went wherever his muse took him.
Yeah,
And I
no,
think that's really cool.
That was interesting. I remember having this conversation maybe like a year ago. I forget who I was having it with, but essentially, oftentimes, and maybe it's just maybe how the business is nowadays, where oftentimes when a writer starts in one genre, 9 times out of 10, they're expected to stick to that genre. Like this is where you are. They get pigeonholed. And I mean, quite honestly, I even know of some really kind of big famous authors who, are very successful, but they kind of are not necessarily happy because they're not, they have to keep writing a certain type of book, as opposed to Crichton, where, yeah, you're right. I mean, he wrote, you look at the books and you're like, and sometimes even authors, they'll write different types of books, but they're often the same type of story, or it follows the same type of formula. Crichton was, you never really knew what you were going to get. I remember actually, and this was one of those things, maybe I would have to go back and reread it, but one of the books that I remember reading of his that I kind of was like, kind of made me, I don't want to say fall out of love with him, but it kind of got me to a point where I was not, he wasn't always like like a first day read for me, where like, the first day the book comes out, I have to get the book, was for some reason Airframe. I don't know why. But when I read Airframe, I was very underwhelmed. And then a lot of his, I kind of, he had other books come out. I kind of, didn't really get to him. But I had read Prey. I thought Prey was really good. And that goes back to the whole science fiction, aspect as well. And I have this the one that came out after he had died, the one with the, it's not dinosaurs, but what is it? The one where it's like in the dragon teeth. Was it Dragon Teeth? Yeah, I have that. I've not had a chance to read that yet. And I think there's supposed to be some other stuff coming out at some point. But I mean, you look at just, I mean, we're going to be talking about Michael Crichton the entire time, but I mean, you think about just how influential he is. I mean, Jurassic Park was huge. They have still Jurassic World. I mean, it's going to be a new Jurassic World coming out in another week or two. You have Westworld coming up on this 4th season. And it just seems like, I mean, then you had ER, you had Twister, like even the stuff he was doing in film. It's, if you look back, step back at his, his overall career. And I know that, and I remember you mentioned this before, you can get into kind of his ideals later in life. Is one of those things where it's really kind of, I guess, where you really have to separate the artist from the art. Because there are times where you might be like, ugh, I don't know if I want to read this anymore, but you really still have to respect just how influential it all was. Even again, even on you, because you even said it when you wrote Child Zero. I mean, you had that in the back of your head.
Oh, absolutely. And in fact, I mean, I was just thinking, obviously, his with Jurassic Park, he introduced the world to chaos theory, was another thing that was integral in Jurassic Park. The whole butterfly flapping its wings having the downstream effect. He was sort of the person who brought that to the fore of pop culture, and it was so influential on me that I ended up getting into chaos theory. Was a forerunner of what's known as complexity theory, which is like analyzing complex dynamic systems. And I actually wrote like a miniature philosophy of science thesis in my undergrad about complexity theory and about like different modes of scientific thought. And it was just because I was a geeky kid who worshipped at the altar of Michael Crichton. The thing that I always find interesting about him is even when he drifted, he still was engaging the audience. I mean, I'm thinking about State of Fear in particular, which is not a good book. That was his climate denier book. But I love that he was still making arguments. I actually would love to have been able to sit down with him and talk that out, because as a scientist myself, I'm like, you yourself are denying a ton of data that's contrary to your own thesis that, this is largely not man-made. It's largely, overblown. I think he's just a fascinating dude. I think he just was a stubborn, fascinating guy who followed his muse wherever it took him, and certainly took no shortage of critical dings over the course of his career. and it didn't slow him down in the slightest, which is fascinating to me because I get a bad review and I'm a mess for a week.
All right. So enough Michael Crichton. Although I will say there is a nice homage to a Michael Crichton in your in Child Zero. I don't want to really give it away, but there's a character in there who's reading a book, and you describe the cover. It's a very iconic cover.
It is an iconic cover.
With I think it was it Chip Kidd, I think designed that. And
that's exactly right.
But anyway, so yeah, I remember reading that being like, okay, I can see. And then, with the rest of the book, it's like, okay, clearly Michael Crichton had a huge influence on that. And actually just kind of jumping to again, we're going to talk about Child Zero in a little bit. So what happened? Like, when was do you remember the first story you wrote?
I do remember the first story I wrote because it literally got me sent to the principal's office. I remember we were supposed to, I guess the assignment was like make a picture book. And I was 6 years old. I don't even think it was supposed to have text. But I wrote a 3-page book called The Alien Deaths from Outer Space. And it was lavishly illustrated, a lot of red crayon. It was, an alien invasion story, and then people defeated them and everything. And it was an assignment for class to come up with this story. And I ended up getting called down to the principal's office because he wanted to ask me a bunch of questions about it. And I literally just thought he was enthusiastic about my story. I felt like I'd done something great. And now, of course, I realized he was just trying to make sure that there was nothing wrong at home and that I wasn't going to go on a killing spree. So yeah, I very vividly remember, I don't remember so much the writing of the story, but I very clearly remember sitting in my principal's office and asking these questions about it. He had it sitting on his desk. It was, that sort of wide rule paper that they give, kindergartners to practice their, letters. And it was bound with red yarn. And after that, I remember after he talked to me, he gave me a Hershey bar and said, I just wanted to congratulate you on writing such a good story. But don't tell anybody where you got this candy bar, or they're going to get upset. We have a canine cameo.
The dog's in my office, and I think he heard something at the door, and he goes crazy. Gotcha. So anyway,
the dog is your dog's name Bishop? Is that right?
He is named Bishop. Yes.
He's a cutie. I've seen him on the Facebooks.
Yeah, he's a mutt. He's a purebred mutt. We got him from a shelter program, like at the prison where they like raise them. So.
Wow.
Something. So anyway, I apologize for my dog. What were you saying?
Oh God, never apologize.
Go on. What was that?
No, it was. I don't remember writing the story very clearly. I mean, obviously, I was a giant science fiction geek even from a super early age, but I very clearly remember the response to it. And I felt like I'd done something. I felt like I'd done something important. I told a story, and somebody gave me a candy bar for it. It was probably what eventually, led me to do this for a living. Yeah. Do you remember your first story? Do you remember how far back you'd have to go to think about what your very first work of fiction was?
So I guess what I was thinking of, the first time you had sat down to basically write a story to send it out to get it published. But that's a good point. I'm sure in elementary school, I probably had written something. I remember even I think it was 6th grade, having written a 1 or 2 page paper, and it was like a narrative type thing. And I remember making some type of comment oh, it was World War III, and the teacher's note coming back being well, this takes place in this. So the First World War hadn't started yet. And I'm thinking in retrospect, I'm I don't know. It was just one of those editorial comments where you're okay, if you're being technical, but
I love it. By the way, I love that every tween boy starts with World War III. That was the sci-fi story I was hiding under my bed and writing longhand. That was a World War III story. That's it. Then we all go right there.
Well, so to be clear though, it wasn't. It was this something was happening it was World War III. Well, you know what I mean? It wasn't World War III, but it was making a almost a comparison to it, but it wasn't. But yeah, I'm trying to think what the first. I remember one of the first stories I wrote. So this was having come up, reading Crichton and reading Stephen King. I decided, okay, I want to be a horror writer. So a lot of my first short fiction stuff was very, I guess horror-esque. And I had published a few things here and there in high school, and then in college. And I remember meeting with some writer friends somewhere, and someone had sent me, because most of the crowd I was hanging out with were were horror writers. And at one point, someone had said to me, like, why are you with us? They're like, you're not really a horror writer. And at the time I
Wow.
kind of like, and and they weren't saying it to be mean or anything,
No, no,
but
it's
it was this idea. And I mean, in retrospect, I don't think I really, I have written and published some stuff, but like clearly what my, um, what I really enjoy doing, where my passion is more of the, thriller type
mhm.
stuff. So with you, I mean, do you kind of feel, because like, and this is something that I wanted to talk about too. I mean, you've really jumped different genres, kind of like, I guess, Michael Crane, where, the first story I've interacted with you was the Hitter, which was
Mhm.
a, mystery crime thriller story. And that then and then the first novel you had out was the Collector trilogy. You had the Collector
Yeah.
trilogy, which was not like thriller crime. I mean, it crime in a way, but I mean, it was essentially genre, supernatural. And then from there you go to the Hendricks books, and then now you're
Yeah.
here to this. So it's like, clearly you've not really felt the need to kind of stick with one genre. Was that one of those things where, I mean, was the first Collector novel the first book you wrote, or just the first book that was published?
It was just the first book that was published. So to go back to your prior question, I remember exactly what my first story that I wrote with an eye toward publication was. It was a story called The Toll Collectors. It was a horror story. Um, and I had already been working on, I had one failed attempt at a novel, and I was nearing the end of um, my first finished novel when I decided to write this short story, probably just as a craven way to pad my upcoming query letter at the time. But I was inspired by, there is this abandoned stretch of highway in Pennsylvania that has these three tunnels. And I'm just fascinated by abandoned and liminal spaces. And so I stumbled across some old like GeoCities blog about this crazy stretch of road, and it inspired me to want to write a horror story about it. And it was like a crime horror story. I, like an idiot, submitted it to Ellery Queen's mystery magazine, and they were never ever going to publish it. Um, and it eventually got accepted by this teeny tiny press that I am not going to out by name, because, well, the fact is, it turns out the gentleman who ran that press, that had several small magazines, had been using it as a mill to sort of pad his own resume by publishing stories under a series of pseudonyms. He did it the wrong way around. Instead of being pseudonymously an editor, he published his own stories but under different people's names. And so he accepted my very first short story, The Toll Collectors. And then meanwhile, I had been writing other shorts, and I had gotten an acceptance from Ellery Queen, because when I got that first rejection from them, I was like, "You bastards! Like I'm gonna write something. I dare you to reject this one." And so I wrote like an obvious like Stephen King coming of age pastiche story that they ended up accepting, but they wanted to put it in there.
So one of your very first short stories was the Ellery Queen.
My first published short story was in Ellery Queen. Yes,
Damn.
it was called The World Behind, um, and but they wanted to publish it in the Department of First Stories, and so I had to email this dude who had accepted my first story. And I mean, it was like a $10, market, and I was like, hey, would you mind pushing it to the next issue? Because they're asking if this could be my first credit. And he was like, yeah, no problem. And then in the ensuing couple of months between those issues, he got outed for having basically snaked his way into a bunch of publication credits, and like vanished off the internet. So that story never came out through him.
I'm trying to think who that was, because back then, I mean, I
I,
had been in that
I,
section, and we'll talk about that later. We'll talk
yeah,
about that off camera.
I know exactly who it is, and I'm trying hard not to say his name because it was. I don't think he intended any harm. I think he went about something in exactly the wrong way. Did some boneheaded stuff. He actually did eventually have a book come out on a major press. I have no idea what he's up to now. But yeah, so but he didn't even tell me like, hey, this isn't happening. Sorry. he just vanished. Uh, and so I not knowing anything about rights was like, am I allowed to submit this elsewhere? Is this going to come out? So it was a weird thing, but eventually that story, the Toll Collectors, came out in B2 of Pulp. That was what I first submitted to David Cranmer of B2 of Pulp, and we have since gone on to be good friends. And although, like you, we've never met in person, I've I must have published 5 or 6 stories with him by now in various anthologies and stuff. So it was the Wild West back then with like internet publications. It was a lot of fun to make those connections.
Oh yeah.
So yeah, my first short ever was Ellery Queen, which is bizarre.
That's amazing.
Yeah.
I'm even more impressed, and I'm already impressed with you. So I mean, the first published story in Ellery Queen. Yeah, I mean, man, I used to have a box somewhere, with, the little zines that had, someone clearly printed out from their, home printer and stapled, and, it's one of those things where, like, I'm glad I wrote those stories. I'm glad I had those published, but at the same time, in retrospect, it's like, who was really reading these stories except maybe the authors who were getting contributor copies? Or it's like, like there was, I remember, being so naive after having published, having a story accepted, being in some, like, I think it was in a mall, and it was, like you remember back in the day, they used to have those like magazine shops where it was just like 1,000 magazines, and like, walking through there being like, I wonder if I can find, this magazine, and then actually then receiving it in the mail and being like, oh, okay, there's no way this would ever be anywhere else. Like, yeah. So
yeah, and I've done my share of those too. But I'll tell you, it's interesting. You brought up The Hitter, which ended up in Best American, and not coincidentally, I ended up adapting to become The Killing Kind, because it had been so well received. But that one, I mean, I wrote that for a buddy's magazine that didn't even exist when he invited me. Steve Weddle had kind of looked around in, I guess, the late aughts or whatever, and said, I'm seeing a lot of crime fiction websites that are publishing shorter stories. Stories are getting shorter and shorter. He's like, I want to do one that's print, where we can put some bigger, meatier stuff that maybe doesn't get as many eyeballs online. And he was like, so I've got this idea. He and John Horner Jacobs were kicking around ideas, and they decided to make Needle magazine. And he emailed me and was like, hey, we'd love for you to write a longer story to anchor our second issue. He's like, I can't pay you, I can't promise anybody's going to read it, but do you want to give me 10,000 words for free? And I actually just lost my job. It was like right around the economic downturn, and I had been working for a small startup that folded, and I was going out of my mind. I was like, yeah, sure. In between looking for a new job, I'll just see if I can bang out something that that fits the bill. So I gave that story away and assumed no one would see it. I assumed maybe 20 people would see it. So, which just clearly demonstrates that I'm an idiot who has no idea how any of this works, because I ended up, the reprint rights I got paid more for the reprint rights of that than any short story I have ever published.
I can imagine.
And then, yeah.
So actually just tell us about that. Cause I mean, not everybody, I mean, yes, it was reprinted in Best American Mystery Stories. This was the 2011 edition. Harlan Coben was the guest editor. Was it just like one day you received an email and being like, hey, we want to do this? Or did you get like word ahead of time? Like, oh, maybe we're considering this? Or like, how was that experience like?
So I wish it were an email, because there was some shrieking and some jumping up and down when I was notified. And it happened at my mailbox, because I opened my mail and there was a letter from Otto Penzler of Mysterious Bookshop, Mysterious Press. And, I was like, I literally plucked it out of my mailbox and thought, what the hell is Otto Penzler doing writing me a letter? Like, why does Otto Penzler even know that I exist? And for context, for people who don't know anything about Otto, he, for a guy like me who grew up reading a lot of pulps, he's something of a legend. I mean, in the original Mysterious Bookshop, Donald Westlake helped him put up the shelves. I mean, so he kind of had a role in sort of the genre as I came up reading it. So I knew that he was the editor of Best American. I opened it up, and it said that they wanted to make an offer to include the hitter. And yeah, I freaked out. I had like a little dance party at the end of my driveway. I'm sure that was not flattering. But yeah, and actually, so it mentioned that of course it was he and Harlan Coben. They have a different guest editor every year. I do not mean this as a slight to Harlan Coben. I do not know the man. I have nothing against him, but I will say that the following BoucherCon, I saw him in the book room, and thought, you know what, I'm going to go introduce myself and thank him for the inclusion. And so I did. I went up and said, you know, Mr. Coben, my name is Chris Holm, and I just wanted to say thank you so much, you know, for choosing my story. It meant a lot. It actually is. It's been a career changer for me. You know, it's attracted the interest of some bigger publishers. I was on a very small press at the time, so you know, it really in a lot of ways changed my life. And he looked at me and he squinted and he said, I think you were one of Otto's, and then turned and walked away. And I was like, I don't know if it was a joke or if he was dead serious, but either way, it was like, I literally couldn't have asked for a better interaction because it's such a good story. Maybe I caught him in a mood. I don't know. So I attempted to thank him. And I mean, even if I had been one of Otto's pet selections, he could have easily been like, yeah, no problem, kid. Good luck out there. And I would have walked away feeling like $1 million.
That's interesting because I always, I mean, my understanding was always that like Otto or whoever the series editor was, basically kind of narrows the stories down to was like 100 or whatever, or 50, and then the guest editor is the one that then reads those stories and then picks from there. So, well, it doesn't matter anyway. You were in the anthology, and that's all that matters.
Right, I was
still.
No, I just thought that was such a funny interaction. That how do you not tell that story? And again, no offense, Harlan Coben, please don't try and ruin my career.
No, I mean, I will say that Harlan he does have a very good comic sensibility, but that is still a very weird interaction. I guess if that's what happens.
It was very, very funny, and I also could have just interrupted him in the middle of God knows what, but yeah, it was just one of those hilarious authorial interactions. Yeah. But it was such a thrill to be in that, regardless of how I ended up there.
Oh,
accidental or otherwise.
And then, all right. So then how do we get, so then let's go to the collector then trilogy. So then how did you end up kind of going, how did that happen?
You know, I'm terrible at knowing how any of it actually happened, because I've been getting a lot of questions about like the pivot toward medical thrillers with Child Zero. And I was like, I don't even know if I would have called it a medical thriller. I guess for me, I made a promise to myself when I decided to take this seriously as something I wanted to do for a living, that I wanted to do it on my own terms. In fact, I have a tattoo that it's a tattoo of a typewriter and some crossed fountain pens that says "Write bravely," and it's from a quote from an old newsman named Bill Stout, who said in a commencement speech, whether or not you write well, write bravely. And I like that because you're not always necessarily in full control of whether or not you're capable of writing well, but I can always write bravely. I can always write with guts. And my thought was, coming up, this is such a crazy dream. This is such an insane thing to want to do for a living, that why would I be timid in trying to do it? I'm going to take the biggest swing I can every time I sit down at a keyboard. And so for me, the very first book I finished landed me the agent who ended up selling my collector trilogy. Dead Harvest was the first book in that. But that first book didn't actually find a publisher. And it was sort of a small town mystery with like a paranormal element. And I knew at the time that I was querying for that one, that the next one was going to have more overt paranormal elements. And so I focused on people who dealt with that. My first agent repped Jim Butcher, who does the Harry Dresden books. And that was very much by design. I knew what I was working on next. And I thought, yeah, I'm probably going to end up writing in this sort of paranormal vein for a while. And I did. I fully anticipated that would be an open-ended series. I feel like I'm spilling all kinds of tea here, but I've mentioned this before online. I found out that I was not going to be writing any more collector books when a buddy of mine who runs a magazine, John Jordan of Crime Spree, offered me some free ad space for the collector series, just as a kindness, because he thought more people should read it. And I told my publisher, and they were like, "Yeah, we'll work up some graphics for it." And it took some hounding, and when I finally got the graphics back, they referred to the third book in the series as the thrilling conclusion to the critically acclaimed collector trilogy. And I thought, geez, that's a hell of a way to find out. Yeah, I had envisioned it as like a 3-book arc, but I very much intended to write more books in that series. So that's where my first pivot came from. I was like, maybe I not only
So you
was
were
on
like
a small,
forced into it, kind of like it
yeah,
was
I was
basically
not
like,
only on a
okay.
small press, I was dropped by my small press. And in fact, that's a little harsh. They actually, at the time, were looking at launching a crime fic imprint that unfortunately didn't really get properly off the ground before it tanked. But they wanted me to write some crime fiction. They were like, maybe we pivot a little bit toward something that, I don't know, people want to read. I always joke that like about 100 people read my collector books, but everyone who read them seemed to really enjoy them. They were well received, they were well reviewed, but and they certainly still have their adherents. I still get people asking me if I'm going to write another one, and I hope to one day. I hope that they'll find their way back into print. That's my like selfish goal as an author, is just find something that hits big enough that I can keep telling all of the stories I want to keep telling, and pop back into them as the muse allows. So that was where the first pivot came from. Was okay, this supernatural story I was trying to tell didn't catch fire with an audience, and I had just written the hitter, and it had done well, and that was when I started trying to work on that as a novel, and figured, okay, it's more of a mainstream thriller. Maybe I'll find a mainstream publisher. And instead, my agent, who had pushed me hard to adapt that into a novel, she sat on the manuscript for 7 months before getting back to me and saying, I don't know what to say, but I think this book is unpublishable. So it was tough. I spent a good few months thinking, well, that was a good run. I've got 3 books published. It's better than most people do. But this might be it for my literary career.
Well, and then
yeah.
you wisely either parted ways with her or dumped her, or
Yeah,
she dumped you, and
yeah, no, it was my decision. Although at that point, I think it was all but assured that we would go our separate ways, just because we clearly didn't see eye to eye. I was like, I think something could be made of this book, and she disagreed. She didn't think we should rewrite it. And to be clear, and to give her some credit, it did undergo dramatic rewrites before it did get published. But that was largely with my agent, because he in his prior life was an editor, and he likes to dig
David
into stories.
Gernhardt, who was John Grisham's editor, and then ended up becoming John Grisham's agent, and he's
That's
currently
exactly
reps
right.
like Stuart O'Nan and a bunch of other people.
Oh yeah, yeah, and Peter Straub, and yeah, he's terrific. What's
now,
crazy
what was
is,
he like? Did you just reach out to him, or did you query a bunch of different agents, and just he was the one that you connected with, or how did that work out?
So I got both of my agents just by blind querying. I didn't know anybody in the business when I started at all. The first time out, when I was looking for my first agent, that was that was the horror story that all fledgling authors hear. It was like 90 something queries, maybe 10 or 15 partials. I ended up getting 2 offers of representation, but it was, that was a long slog. My second agent search after my first agent and I parted ways was much more targeted. Again, I'm a science nerd, so I dug into the data. I signed up for Publishers Marketplace. I did a bunch of database searches to figure out who was selling big in thrillers, who was repping people who I admired. And I think my first set of queries was my 4 or 5 absolutely top choices, and overwhelmingly got a good response from them, in large part because I could say, hey, the short story that this is based on was in the Best American Mystery Stories. I could point them towards some favorable reviews for my other books, and that certainly helped. But David, although he did very quickly ask for the full manuscript from the opening chapter that I sent him, ultimately passed on it. But said, and this is a quote, "Not for nothing, I have some thoughts if you'd like to look at them." And he sent along like 6 single-spaced pages of notes about my book, which was the most editing I had ever gotten in my career to that point. At that point, I had about 20 short stories out, 3 novels, and no one had ever given me extensive notes before.
Yeah, that's and we can do shop talk some other time more in depth, but yeah, that, I mean, I've gone through several different agents, and my most recent agent is very, hands-on in terms of like editorial, with notes, and she'll even like go through, like with like a line edit for like, to actually go through like one of my first agents, essentially. I remember I was I forget which book it was, but it was very general, like you might just want to change this around. You know what I mean? It was just, it was very like, I didn't really know what was going on, like
Yeah.
honestly, I mean, I didn't even get like ever like a submission list, quite honestly, for and he was a very big, and still is a very big agent, and just but yeah, I mean, the fact that at that time David wasn't even going to offer you the representation, it wasn't even, because occasionally you'll get an agent who will be like, I see potential here. Would you be willing to work with me on this and see what we can do? It was basically like, this isn't right for me, but I have these notes, and they send you 6 pages of notes. That is, I mean, that's amazing, quite honestly.
It was crazy. It was crazy. And I dug into them, and I was terrified. I was like, this is going to shatter me, to read these notes. And as it turns out, they were terrific. And we ended up emailing back and forth a bunch, and lots of drafts, yada, yada. But it just turned out to be a kind of a fruitful, creative collaboration. So it was a very different book after we were done with it. But it wasn't any less my book. I think it was just that he had a good sense of what I was trying to do, and how far short I had fallen from what I was trying to do, which I think is a good thing. I think, I don't lack for ambition, but I didn't study this in school, and I've been learning as I go, and so it's so that's where that came in. And then after the second book in the Hendricks series, I had told him, like, I want to write a standalone, and I want to take a big swing. I want to see if I can make another leap akin to the leap I made going from the collector series on a small press to like a big a major press hardcover release. I wanted to do something that was going to be big and commercial. And I remember hearing someone once say, I want to be the author that your hairdresser can't stop talking about. And I love that. That's what I want. I want to, I would love to be that author that if somebody only reads 6 books a year, mine is one of them, I probably should have included a little less science if I want that to be the case. But certainly in terms of trying to make a swing and do a big, high concept, fun, scary thriller, that was my goal. And so I had pitched David some ideas, and one of them happened to be, let's tackle something that takes place in a post-antibiotic era.
So was that, when you said you pitched it, was that to your editor over at Mulholland? Because you have Josh Kendall, right? So
I do.
Was that something that you talked to David, your agent, about, or was it that you talked to the publisher about? You know what I mean?
No.
Like, what was that?
Yeah, so it was just David, and the reason why is because I had signed a 2-book deal with Mulholland for the Killing Kind, and originally my thought was I would do a standalone as a follow-up, because my concern was you do a second in series, and it's kind of it's kind of one bite at the apple in terms of, getting foreign rights sold, film rights, things like that, because, once that character is already out in the world, the second in series doesn't always attract the same amount of attention critically or commercially. And so I thought, hey, maybe alternating would be a cool idea. And it just ultimately didn't work that way, in large part because The Killing Kind was as well received as it was. Mulholland really wanted a sequel. And, Josh and I worked really hard to make sure the sequel lived up to the original. And I'm really proud of Red Right Hand. But I was kind of burned out on the timeline of that one. Was like, I'm a slow writer. And that one I wrote in about 7 months. And it was, from start to finish to like submission. And it was a grueling process. And I was like, I think I need to take a step back and do something at my own pace. So I didn't write Child Zero under contract at all. We didn't even take it to Mulholland until after it was done. And that was my choice, not because I didn't want to stay at Mulholland. They're terrific. And I work really well with Josh, and I love their stable of authors. But it was because I didn't want the pressure of writing to deadline. And I feel like it's the second I sign a contract and cash a check, I feel like I better darn well produce. I've never missed a deadline in my life, and I sure don't want to start.
So to be clear, you wrote the book first and then showed it to Mulholland, as opposed to just a proposal. Because I mean, I'm kind of the same way where, and I've had this conversation too with my agent, and she knows that I like I hate outlining. Like I won't outline, you know what I mean? Because for me, just I guess, well, and this actually goes to a question we have here from the chat or earlier from Chris Alexander. He had asked, he really enjoyed Child Zero. Well, he or she, I guess it's Chris, I don't know, really enjoyed Child Zero. But the question was, during the outlining process or the ideation process, did you start with the premise first, or did you start with the ending in mind and then begin filling in the middle? And that can also kind of lead into the idea of, and I hate using the term, plotter and pantser, but that same idea of, like, do you outline? Because, I know like someone like Jeffrey Deaver will basically spend months just on an outline before he even starts writing, as opposed to someone like, Harlan Coben has famously said, it's like a road trip. He knows where he's going to end up. The ending might change, but he really knows where he's going to end up in, California. He's going to start in New Jersey, but what happens along the way, he has no idea. So like, how does that work for you then?
So normally with my other two series, it started with a character. It started with a single scene from that character's perspective that kind of played through my head, that I was able to kind of break down and interrogate, like, who is this person? Why are they where they are? How do they come to be there? What are their motivations? That's where those ones came from. Both Sam Thornton from the Collector trilogy and Michael Hendricks from the Hendricks novels. This one really did start from the premise of, I want to tell a story that takes place in a post-antibiotic world. And I often think of like the difference between a novel and a short story idea for me is often a novel idea isn't one idea, it's the intersection of a few ideas. And I also think of it as like, if I can wrap my head around it in its entirety, it's probably a short story. But if I can't quite see the edges of the puzzle, if I feel like I'm standing too close to the picture to see it all, it's probably a novel. And I need to kind of step back and think about it that way. So the two things that, without spoiling too much about Child Zero, that intersected was this idea of a post-antibiotic era that scientists have been clamoring, warning that it's imminent for about a decade now, and our evolving understanding of the community of microbes that live in, on, and around us, called the human microbiota. And I kind of had this interesting idea for how those two things would intersect. And that was sort of the genesis of the idea of Child Zero. So it really was premise first, not character. And I think that's part of the reason it took so long for me to write this book, is I spent a lot of time doing research on the premise, and the characters that I created evolved from that research. That said, the whole plotter or pantser thing, I never quite know where I fall on that spectrum. I do not outline. I definitely don't outline. Like, there's no, I've tried it in the past. It's always been an abysmal failure. And in fact, it's a source of some shame as a science nerd. I'm like an Excel master. And so I've tried like all kinds of crazy outlines in Excel. And what I end up with is a really crazy outline that I never then turned into a novel. Because I feel like once I figure out every little twist and turn, it's no longer that interesting to me. I tend to know the first scene, the last scene, and a few key tent poles in between. And then for me, it's all about finding ways to connect those dots.
Right.
Sometimes those tent poles will just be a really cool set piece I'm desperate to use. I mean, there's a few of those in Child Zero. There's this crypto anarchist collective, which is what they call themselves. They're really just a bunch of meth heads and malware scammers that live in like a burned out building in Manhattan. I just wanted to write that sequence because I thought it'd be fun. There's a bazaar that takes place in the book in an abandoned subway station. I just wanted to write a cool thing in an abandoned subway station. So I didn't even necessarily know how I was going to use them. It was just like, if I'm picturing it like a scavenger hunt, here are the spots I'm going to hit, and I'll figure it out from there. It's not the most efficient way to write, but I like it because I feel like it forces me to problem solve on the fly. And if I can't predict where the story's going, I can't imagine anybody else can. Like, I always love it when people are like, I saw this coming. And it was like, how could you have? I had no idea.
And
Yeah.
I got in a bad review for one book one time where there was like, it feels like the writer was just making it up as he went along. And it's like, well, yeah, that's what we do.
That's literally the entire gig.
But no, is that idea where I mean, and that's the thing too about outlining. Like I had to outline for something, and like a year later when I finally wanted to sit down and start writing the book, I realized I actually don't want to write what I wrote. I want to do, like the same starting off point, but kind of go in a different direction, because it just felt like, it became old to me, old and stale. And then I, like you, it's that, that exploration, that kind of like not knowing what's going to happen in the next chapter. You have an idea, but something could happen. Like one of my earlier books I thought it was going to be a novella, quite honestly. And I had a character walking down an aisle with somebody, and there was a janitor. They just, they happen to walk by a janitor. And that completely changed the entire book around, because then we found out that this janitor actually was this guy who ended up putting this bomb in this, you know what I mean? And then the entire book, and then like had I, sat down with an outline, like you never really know, because you're not in that, you're in your head. And then that same idea about, being surprised, because yes, if you're not surprised, then the reader is definitely not going to be surprised.
Yeah.
So
I always think too, I think it's funny sometimes that literary types look down on genre fans and genre writers, because I actually think genre readers are some of the savviest readers on the planet. They are so steeped in what they love, whether it's mystery or romance or Western. They're so steeped in sort of the tropes of the genre that they're very good at predicting where stories go. As a writer, I like to try and subvert those expectations. I feel like I can weaponize those. If I can see like, oh, this feels like where the story seems like it's going, I'm going to try and take it in another direction. And so for me, I feel like I'm best at doing that if I'm constantly analyzing on the fly, is this well-trod ground, or am I getting off the map a little bit? I don't want to have the same beats as every other story out there. That's always fun for me, is just trying to figure out ways to subvert expectations. And much like your janitor in Red Right Hand, the moment where I went from being completely lost and having no idea where the middle third of the book was going to go, to being like, oh my God, I know what this book is about, was I have a character on the run trying to break into what he thinks is an abandoned house to hide out. And he like looks up, and there's a woman staring at him from the other side of the glass. And she doesn't scream, and she doesn't call the cops. She unlocks the door and lets him in. And I was like, I literally had no idea what was going to happen next, but I wanted to know, because I was like, I need to know everything about this lady. Who does that?
Right.
And it was such a kick. It was like, there's that dopamine hit you get as an author when your characters do something you don't anticipate. It's I think kind of why we get up and do this most of the time.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, yeah, there have been times like I've wanted to, for two books now, in my one series, I've been wanting to add in some type of like 3D printing as like a big like plot point. But as I start writing it, that completely goes away because like the story changes to completely different else, because obviously I don't know about you, but before I write a book, very rarely will I sit down. My one novel, Man of Wax, I sat down knowing just the chapter one. That was it. And then that was actually one I wrote that first draft in like 3 weeks. It was like 90,000
Wow.
words. And from that, it was, just going, chapter by chapter by chapter. Like I literally had no idea. Like I was experiencing it as I was writing it, as
Hmm.
opposed to other books where like, I've had ideas. Sometimes when I come up with a book idea, there are book ideas where I feel like you come up with an idea, but you're working on other stuff. And I never really like to write down things for some reason, because I feel like
Hmm.
if in a year or two I still have that book idea, I know that that's a book idea that's worth writing, as opposed
Yes.
to a book idea that you might think is like, oh, this is cool, but then like you forget in like a week or two. And so
Yeah.
the ones that really stick with me, like I'll have in my head, and I'll just be thinking, I'll be doing like I'll be at the grocery store or whatever, and I'll just be thinking like, well, what's going to happen next in this story? Because I like when you're writing, I don't know if it was F. Paul Wilson or someone had basically said that like when he's writing a book, he's not only thinking about his next book, but also the book after that. Like, how
Hmm.
far ahead are you thinking, like, in terms of, what's next?
Well, it's interesting because I think nothing's ever wasted. Um, because which is something all writers say, and then I never understood when I was starting out. But for example, the books I've been kicking around with writing next, one of them is the first novel I attempted to write, but didn't have the chops to finish, and that would be. I think it's the likeliest winner because it'd follow on with Child Zero nicely. It's kind of a sciency thriller, but it's also gonna, um, I had a sort of I'm going to completely take credit for an epiphany that was not mine. My wife said, so I was like, man, I really want to write like a coming of age story, like set in the 80s. That's also, like kind of a Stranger Things kind of thing, but with like science fiction instead of horror. Um, and she was like, so the book that I tried to write, it was called The Circumference of Darkness. And she was like, well, why not? What if you made that one the YA sort of coming of age style thing? And I was like, oh hell, that's been the missing piece. That's why I couldn't write it a decade and a half ago. Um, so yeah, I feel like you, I don't write a lot of story ideas down. I'll occasionally shoot myself an email, but honestly, most of those I never go back to. It's the ones that your brain just won't stop cycling through and trying to figure out that you just want desperately to write. I also had a failed TV pitch a while back that I say failed. It was one of the best experiences of my life. I teamed up with a producer who just needed a thriller writer to help him flesh out an idea, and we ended up pitching it to HBO as a miniseries, which is amazing because I literally was like sitting at home and he's like, "You're comfortable pitching, right?" And I was like, "Oh, of course I'm comfortable pitching." And like the moment he hung up, I was like, "How to pitch a TV show?" I honest to God. Um, and I asked some friends who obviously have a whole lot more experience than I do. Um, but and ultimately nothing came of it. But I haven't stopped thinking about that story since. So one of these days I'm going to have to write it.
Yeah.
To see what happens. It's um, like I said, I'm a slow writer. I think I'm also. This sounds funny to say because I don't think I'm an idiot, but I'm a slow thinker. I like to
Mm.
really like mull and kind of
So,
consider things from every angle before I put them down on the page.
okay. So then that actually brings up another question. Like when you're writing a first draft,
Hmm.
do you then spend a lot of like say like for me, I don't know who really coined the term, but I do like, mostly like vomit drafts, like I think like Nora Roberts is very famous for that. I mean, like,
Hmm.
I try to just like I don't go back as I'm writing and like edit or whatever else, or like, I know some authors, I think I sort of Nan, I think like he like tries to do like 1 page a day.
Hmm.
And I know like, TC Boyle has talked about where like, as he's writing, he will be editing as he's writing. So when he's basically done with his manuscript, it's done.
Hmm.
Whereas, for me, I like to just get the story out as quick as possible and then kind of go back, maybe things will kind of get tightened up or maybe things are going to get added here and there. Like, how does that work then for you?
Uh,
Or does that maybe change based on, what you're working on?
yeah, I think badly is the way that works for me. I actually, so I love the vomit draft idea. I call mine garbage draft. Like I've tried to set myself rules. I have some obsessive compulsive tendencies, and so I have a tendency to just edit endlessly. And so I learned a couple of coping mechanisms. Like I would title it either draft zero or garbage draft when I start, writing. And I would say like, okay, you're allowed to comb it once. Like, write a chapter, you finish it. If you can comb it once, then you can move on. You can't touch it again. I used to write a lot more words in a day than I do now, which is deeply frustrating to me. I remember in my collector days, I was, getting a couple of thousand words a day, and I'd be, chugging right along. I can't do it anymore. I don't know why. My brain just won't seem to let me. I wish I was as prolific as you. Like I would like nothing more than to be able to get those 90,000 words, because what I like is the editing process afterward. I think that's where the book really takes shape. I wish I could get out of my own way and get that down so that I can get to that step quicker. But it never quite seems to work out that way.
So to be clear, for that novel, I mean, that was a long time ago. I had just graduated college. I was working in a movie theater, and I was like subbing during the day.
Oh, yeah.
So, and I was still living at home. So I had my laptop with me. I would take it to the theater where I worked at the movie theater, and like, the booth, I would write there at work. Sometimes they would call me in a sub, and I'd be like, I'm not feeling good today. I don't want to go in. You know what I mean? So like, it was one of those things, because I think after, was it the first week or whatever, when I realized like, oh, I'm up to almost like 30,000 words. Wow. I was basically like, I just want to see how fast it's going to take. I mean,
yeah.
On a typical, like the book I just recently wrote, I probably wrote that in about the first draft was probably about 2 months. I mean, that was maybe like 75,000 words, you know what I mean? So like, definitely, I think it depends on the book and stuff like that. But I'm also, I mean, I still have a full-time day job. So like, I have to, it's more at nighttime or like on the weekends or whatever else. I mean, are you full-time now or what are you doing?
Yeah, I'm full-time now, which is actually part of the reason I was able to tackle Child Zero. I made my living as a scientist for a long time, and was able to go full-time after The Killing Kind. I wouldn't have tackled a book that had this much science in it while I was still doing science as a day job, because that's too much like bringing my work home, It really took having a few years distance from the gig to figure out how to translate the science in a way that the average person might hopefully find it interesting. Because that's the problem with science nerds, right? We find it all interesting, but what's funny about that is I used to work in my last full-time job was I worked in R&D for a diagnostic company, and that's what I was doing when I got my first book deal. And it was what I was doing through the entire collector trilogy. The day that my first book, my debut novel, was released into the world, we were trying to get a test for canine parvovirus approved by the FDA. Which means I spent all day testing swabs of diseased dog shit in like a fume hood. So like I felt like it was, if there is a higher power, that higher power is trying to keep me humble. It was like, yeah, that's cute, writer boy. You got a novel out, but here's 8 hours of dog shit, quite literally. But yeah, it's always a fun journey with this stuff.
So in terms of, talking about Child Zero, which, by the way, you were kind enough to send me an ARC a while back, but I did get it. I had pre-ordered the hardcover, which I had mentioned to you before. I got a hardcover here, then it has a little bit of a tear on.
I feel like we need to bring this up with the folks at Hachette Shipping, because that's
really
nonsense.
Going to bring down the resale value on eBay. I'm really upset about that. I'm not going to resell it on eBay. Don't worry about it. But I did notice that there's a bibliography in this, which is not something you typically see in thriller novels. I mean, the last book that I remember seeing a bibliography in was actually, I think, Jake Tapper's The Hellfire Club. And that was mostly just more like historical data or whatever else.
Yeah.
So is that something that you felt like from the beginning, you're like, you know what, I've been dealing with all these resources, I want them to include this, or maybe was it a publisher idea, or like, how did that work?
It was entirely my idea. It was there's a couple of things at play there. One, my desire when I set out to write this book, I wanted to write a thriller that was genuinely thrilling, but didn't cut any scientific corners. I didn't want any cheating. In fact, I have, been pretty open about the fact that when I first started sending it to people, I was sending it to people with science backgrounds because I was like, beat this up. Like if I got it wrong, you let me know. One of my first blurbs was from Tess Gerritsen, who's an MD. And yeah, I just felt like I want to put my money where my mouth is. I always grouse about bad pop culture science, in movies and TV and stuff. And I just wanted to see if I could nail it. And part of that was showing my work. I wanted to make it easy for people to figure out where this stuff came from. But part of it was just Crichton would do bibliographies on occasion. And as a fledgling science nerd, I was always so excited about that. I never looked any of them up, but I just thought it was like so cool that like, he did the work and he wasn't afraid to say like, hey, this stuff is legit if you want to dig in deeper. So yeah, that was something that was a part of the book from the get-go. And certainly there are a ton more things that I did not include in that bibliography that influenced it. But, it at least for some of the bigger scientific pivots, I wanted to make sure that there were citations because, that's the world I lived in for a long time. And I have a lot of former colleagues who are going to read this thing. And I just, I wanted to dare them. Hey, if I'm wrong, show me where. Yeah, so that was entirely me. And in fact, it was included when I submitted it to my publisher. And they probably thought I was out of my mind. Like, all the little weird interstitial stuff was in there. My author's note. This was like, it was probably an exercise in pretension on my part, but
And you also include the acknowledgments thanking the editor for buying it even before they bought it.
Yeah, that's right. Of course. Yeah.
Did you? I actually had that happen. Well, no. As a joke, I sent. This was a long time ago for a short story. I ended up writing. It's like a haiku, and I sent it to a friend of mine who ran this magazine, and I sent it under a different email address or whatever, and I basically because like. Did you ever actually like work as an editor for like Read Slush or anything? Because I always tell new writers, and quite honestly, probably would even help older writers, to read Slush because you learn so much, just reading stories that honestly are not very good because, you can tell essentially by the very first page if this is going to be worth reading. But also you also see like all these different cover letters. And just what people will put in with some of the stuff. Like I remember this one person basically being like, my stories are currently under consideration at the New Yorker and these things. And it's like, okay, yeah, all of ours are. Like, what do you? But so I sent him something where basically I said, thank you in advance for accepting this poem, and he ended up actually liking it. It ended up getting published. It was under my own name, but it was just being kind of like very like just pompous. Like yeah, you're gonna accept this. So speaking of Child Zero, in between the not every chapter, but through some of the chapters you have, and they're not really. I don't know. They're not interludes, but like you have these. Well, what would you call them? I mean, you know what I'm talking about.
Yeah. So I called them when I was working on it, my interstitia. And so they were born of a couple of things. This book for me was just an exercise in like the kind of book that like 13-year-old me would have just been nuts over. I love books that do sort of the multimedia stuff. Like if people can see, there's like a fake news piece here, complete with images and stuff. Those were born of a couple of things. I love it when people do that sort of thing because I think it creates some really lean world building. It allows me to flesh out the world that the book takes place in a way that is organic and recognizable to the reader and doesn't bog them down with big info dumps. And sometimes you can play around with it and have some fun. Like sometimes there'll be like an ironic juxtaposition between, say an advertisement for a beautiful, peaceful medical facility, and then you cut to the place and it's a horror show.
And it's like exposition without traditional exposition.
Yeah, and that was something that came about early on in the writing process because I did so much writing that didn't make the book. I actually cut more words that are included in this book because I one of the other goals I set for myself was because it's so science heavy, I didn't want to write a doorstop. I wanted it to be just flat out action from start to finish, if I could pull that off.
Like
And
Michael
so I
Crichton.
had
That was
like Michael Crichton.
like Crichton. There you go.
And so, I always think back to Heinlein, who said, in short stories, world building has to be mercenary, the door dilated. And I always loved that, like as a science fiction thing, like the door dilated. It tells you something about the technology of the the spacecraft that he's describing. And so I wanted to find a shortcut to build this stuff in a way that didn't eat up a lot of space. I also was inspired by a buddy of mine, Marcus Saki, pulled off something similar to this in his Brilliant saga. He had a lot of advertisements and news pieces and stuff. And I just felt like it was this great way to get these little glimpses. It's almost like, some of them, practically qualify as like hint fiction. It's like these little, snippets of the world, little snapshots here and there. There's an entire sort of C or D story in this that is about a vessel trying to make its way from Australia to New Zealand to request what they're calling biological asylum, because in the book, New Zealand is relatively spared from the crisis that's sort of global because they're so geographically isolated. And there's a story that takes place entirely in these interstitial news stories. So it was just fun for me to write and design. But what's interesting is, so it started out all text in my rough draft. They were in the spots where I ended up putting them in sort of a description with a lot of like stock image TK sort of stuff, where I, left myself notes for what I wanted it to look like. And, this one is supposed to look like a propaganda poster from, the Second World War, or, this one is supposed to look like a BBC News piece or a chat room along the lines of 4chan or Reddit. And then I naively assumed that, my publisher would have like a team of artists who would be, dedicated to making this come to life. And it turns out it was just like me and the production manager. And I had to find all the images. And oh, by the way, they had to be like, free to use commercially. So they essentially had to be public domain images, which was its own headache. But it was kind of a kick because I got to do all this art design inside the book. And for good or for ill, these were kind of created from whole cloth by me, which was a lot of fun. Probably a lot more work than I knew when I decided I wanted to do it, but it was still a lot of fun. So this book was just like a wish list of all the cool stuff I wanted to cram into a thriller that I'd never done before.
Yeah, very cool. And it got, Stephen King really kind of praised it, which, he did it on Twitter. It wasn't like, you have a bunch of great blurbs here. You have, on the cover, you have Lee Child blurb. In the back, you got, Matthew Quirk. You mentioned Tess, you even have Matt Bell on here.
Mm-hmm.
So it wasn't something where like the publisher, had reached out to King to be like, hey, would you consider reading this to blurb it? He just happened to read it and liked it enough that he wanted to tell his millions of followers on Twitter, hey, check out this book.
Yeah, it was crazy. If I had to guess, I would say that my agent, David Gernert, probably is responsible for getting it into his hands. But I had no expectation of this. He had no expectation of this. It happened one night. Literally, my wife and I were watching Top Chef, and a friend, Nadine Netman, started blowing up my phone with texts. And the first one I think was just "holy shit" with a lot of exclamation points. So I didn't know what was going on. And by the time I realized and logged on, he already had like 200 retweets, because Stephen King is the kind of guy whose fandom is so rabid that anything he tweets gets, he tweeted about microwaving salmon, and people were like, yeah, let's retweet the hell out of that. But it was probably the most surreal moment of my life. The first adult book I ever read, I remember very clearly, was the Tommyknockers. I was my grandmother was babysitting me. I have an aunt who's only slightly older than I am, so I was 9 or 10, and she had just left home to go to college. And my grandmother said, "Oh, go into Amy's room and pick out any book you want to read." She was just trying to get me out of her hair. And so I went into Amy's room, which was like this sort of shrine to her teen years, and had like, you know, all of her like her you know, books from when she was a kid. And I remember I picked up one. The first one I found was "Are You There, God? It's Me, Margaret." And I picked that up and started reading it. And I was like, yeah, I don't think this is for me. And I set it down. And then I saw on the nightstand somebody who had spent the night, stayed the night, and used it as a guest room, had left a mass market paperback of the Tommyknockers. And I kind of knew that wasn't what she meant when she said pick out any book from Amy's room. So I kind of read it in secret, snuck it home in my backpack, and became such a crazy King fan that I actually I spent $18.50 to go see him talk when I was 13 at the Landmark Theater in Syracuse, and he signed a book for me. It was the first author I'd ever met. It was the only writing event I'd ever attended before I became an author, and so yeah, to get to this point and then have him recommend my work to somebody is just, I mean, beyond mind-boggling. I also was able to get a thank you note to him via email, and he wrote back, which is one of the craziest things that's ever happened to me. So I have this slight OCD, and so in my email inbox, I get really stressed out when I get too many messages in my inbox, and so I tend to archive things into all kinds of crazy folders to keep them organized. So I only have like 4 or 5 emails in my inbox, and that one will never ever leave. That one, you know, the one that just says "from Steve King." I call him Steve because we're so close, but yeah, it's never going to leave my inbox. If I'm ever having a lousy writing day, you know, I'll just have to pop into my inbox and see that I have an email from Stephen King. Yeah.
That is awesome. Well, on that note, I think we should call it a day. So again, the book is Child Zero. It is everywhere. Although I'll be honest with you, because I reached out to you on release day when I went to my Barnes and Noble. It might not be where you think it is in the bookstore. It might be in the thriller section. It might be in the science fiction section. It might be in the general fiction section. Who knows? So definitely make sure
really
you ask the bookseller if you go in there.
Yeah. And, you know, it's funny. Personally, I'd prefer it to be under thriller because that's what I was aiming for, was a mainstream thriller. But man, if people find it because it's in science fiction, it is literally science fiction. It's hard science fiction. It's just not what people, I think, tend to picture when they picture hard science fiction. So, you know, who knows? But thank you so much for having me. This has been a kick, and it's always fun to get a chance to catch up with an online friend in real life, you know, face to face, even if it is virtual.
Absolutely. So again, everybody check out Chris Holm's his website. He's got, you know, actually, and his current the Killing Kind and Red Right Hand right now on Amazon are in the Kindle Unlimited. So if you have Kindle Unlimited,
fantastic.
You can just go ahead and download those for free. But definitely, yeah, check it out. And yeah, thanks, Chris. Congratulations on all the success. I know there's a lot that we didn't get to talk about, but we have been talking now for over an hour. So we want to give people a break. So they'll have to wait for next time then. So
yeah,
thank you.
Thank you.